These are not children for the most part. These, we don't need to infantilize them. So how do we keep people safe from things like, fentanyl showing up in their heroin unexpectedly? And how do we respect their autonomy as adult American citizens?
Well, I think there's a difference between not legislating whether drugs are legal or not and incentivizing people to use them, right? Which is what we saw kind of in California, where the government was providing clean needles for addicts who are homeless or who can't get their hands on clean needles. That turned the city into a dump in maybe less than 2 years. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Angel. I have a podcast about Christianity and conservatism and everything in between. Today, I wanted to bring on a guest that I met through Instagram, actually through the Instagram comments, which are usually very toxic, but in this case was kind of a fruitful debate that we just happened to have. So I reached out to her, asked her if she wanted to come on and, just kind of talk about the difference of opinions that we were having, and she much obliged. So she's the founder of Girls Against Government. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. This is actually my first ever podcast, so
wow,
big moment.
Okay, so this is a first. This is going to be good. I'm excited. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Girls Against Government and just politics in general. What kind of got you involved in it? What got you into it?
Yeah, as far as Girls Against Government goes, it kind of just started as like a fluke pet project, like in the middle of the 2020 election. I just got really tired of not being able to really say what I really thought on my own personal social media accounts. So I was like, all right, I'm just going to make, another one where I can kind of say whatever I want without having to worry about what my friends are going to say in response. And had just kind of hoped to like fill the gap that I felt like I was seeing in, finding other women who are more politically aligned with my ideals and values. I just wasn't seeing that reflected in any kind of like entertaining way. So I'm just trying to kind of bring a new voice to these ideas. New perspective.
For it being your first time on a podcast, you speak very well. I'm assuming that you do something with public speaking for a living, but we don't have to go there. So I want to jump right into it, right? I don't want to waste any time, but the post that we disagreed on, I'll read it really quick. I'll probably throw it up on the screen here, and you can tell me your reaction. I'll read the post and I'll read your comments on it. I grew up with friends who nearly all ended up being drug addicts or overdosing. Legalizing drugs is stupid and will only create a more hedonistic society. Ban all drugs. That was me on Twitter being a mess. And then your response was hard pass. We already know the unintended consequences of prohibition. Consenting adults should have the right to safely pursue happiness via their drug of choice. Legalize all of them. Tax it, regulate it. Send targeted IG ads for rehab to users. Okay, cool. I like the targeted ads part. That's the marketer in me. That's really good.
Yeah, same.
Very cool. So tell me a little bit about that. What was your thought process behind that? I'll just allow you to kind of unpack it.
Yeah, I think for me, like putting any kind of like sweeping regulations in place is always going to kind of get a bit of a like no thanks reaction from me. But I think I kind of want to preface this by saying like, I identify as being more libertarian minded. And I think you mentioned that somewhere in your comments. But like this to me, like legalize all drugs is like the least interesting part about libertarianism, especially with like everything else that's going on in the world. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that libertarians have to say about the rest of the context, but this just happens to be the post that we connected on.
Yeah.
And so I think like, my gut reaction was just like, hell no, basically. But I can definitely empathize with like having lost people to addiction, whether actually like they die or they're just kind of lost souls.
Yeah.
But I think for me, it's kind of like, you know, my political ideals can kind of be summed up in like, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. And I feel like more often than not, anti-drug legislation hurts people.
So I can relate to the idea of libertarianism, or similar to libertarianism when it comes to the idea of kind of live and let live, right? Don't hurt anybody, don't do wrong by anybody, and pretty much let's be left alone. We don't want the government involved in anything, right? It's kind of the leading up to 2016, mostly the conservative talking point of, a big government sucks, right? For me, what that post was more so about, I think, now just like kind of reflecting on it, it's more so of a microcosm of where we sit in politics as far as moralism goes, and what should morality be part of when it comes to politics? How should it be intertwined? So what's your view on that? Should politics have morality within it? What do you think about that whole idea?
Yeah, I think I can't remember who said this quote, but it's America is great because Americans are good. And I think that,
Mm,
makes a lot of sense. And I would agree with you in a sense of like, I can see the degradation of morality in our society and the negative impact that it's having, and, ripple effects into every aspect of life.
right.
Um, but I have a hard time being like, yes, let's try and legislate morality, because I just don't think that it's practical or possible. Like, I think a lot of the overlap between conservatives and libertarians is we both understand human nature. And
Yeah.
we're not living in this like fantastical utopian
Mhm.
perfect world where if we just give government enough power, they can make everything right.
Right.
We understand that, humans are going to human, more or less.
Humans are gonna
And
human. That's a tweet.
and I think that like mind altering substances have been around for all of humanity. I don't think that it's realistic to think we're ever going to be rid of them. So if that's the framework that we're in, then let's work, within that framework rather than trying to change what is.
So my concern when it comes to that is seeing morality be taken apart or taken aside from legislation, just because all laws, in my opinion, are making some sort of assertion about morality. Not necessarily saying that it's good morality, whether you look at like a typical leftist law that bans, I don't know, that has some sort of critical race theory component to it, or you look at the law of the First Amendment. All laws, in my opinion, and you can kind of push back on this, they're all making a moral assumption of some kind. So when I say something like banning, let's say, drugs or illicit drugs specifically, because weed is a different story in my opinion, or banning pornography, or banning all of these vices that people have kind of come to have a crutch on. What I'm saying is I want to make a moral assumption about what would best suit our society as a whole, right? For me, the libertarian framework tends to be something of somewhat of an isolated framework where, everything kind of exists in a bubble. Drug use exists in a bubble. Porn use exists in a bubble, and it's not affecting anybody. But the way I see it is, and if people have that are addicts or have been addicts, you can kind of attest to this. The addiction affects a lot of people. It can affect not only a family member or a person, but it affects a community and then a city and then a state. And so for me, I'm in New Jersey. The opioid epidemic is like surging here within the past 10, 15 years. And it really took a toll on cities, like completely, and not even just inner cities, but, a lot of suburban neighborhoods where, it was mostly, demographically a white problem, right? But that's kind of my problem with the idea of like not legislating morality. It's like at some level, we're only legislating morality. Otherwise, why would we say murder is bad?
Well, because, in America, all of our laws go back to defending life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in my worldview, being able to put whatever you want into your body is a part of the pursuit of happiness. Now, that looks completely different for every person. We're all born under different circumstances. We have no control where we're born, who we're born to, what our early childhood development looks like, those kinds of things that can play into drug addiction. But you're never going to be able to get rid of the demand for substances that can mitigate suffering. And but I'm curious, like, how do you think anti-drug legislation would actually help those things? Because we know, like, we've seen just absolute devastation of communities all across the world, including in our own backyards, with drug addiction. But like, we've been trying to get rid of this problem with the war on
Right.
drugs for 40 years now, and we don't really have much to show for it. So I'm just curious, like, what could we do, really?
Yeah, that's the question, I think. I think where we agree for sure as libertarians and more, I consider myself socially conservative. The corruption in the government is absolute, right? And one of the reasons that we really can't not only legislate, but then also, what's it called, carry out all of these anti-drug laws is because there's always going to be crooked people. There's always going to be crooked cops. There's going to be crooked people in government. So I think we have to set up the laws in a way where it de-incentivizes the crookedness or the corruption within the government, and somehow makes it easier for people to not arrest the casual drug user or even the illicit drug user, but somehow arrest the kingpins and the people that are importing these things, which I guess, considering the hat I'm wearing, which means border control and means all of these other things. And it's kind of a domino effect of where is the source of these problems. But I think putting heavier penalties on the dealers and also penalizing socially and I can get into what that means, but penalizing socially the drug user would mean that it would be less of an incentive for kids to even get into that in the first place, or adults to even get into that in the first place. So I think it's a great point you're making. I do think that there's a really complex solution, but I don't think that there's no solution.
Yeah. Well, and we know how great governments are at handling complex solutions.
Yeah. But to your point, I mean, I guess to push on your point a little bit more, I don't know if legalizing it all, taxing it and selling ad space on it is the solution either.
Yeah, I think for me though, like, when you talk about like finding the root source of the problem, like, and talking about other countries and those things, the only reason that those industries and markets exist is because there is a demand for it, and the demand is here. And in my opinion, it's coming from some deep-seated form of emptiness in our souls that we've got a God-sized hole in our hearts, and we're looking for anything to fill it.
I agree.
But that's not an issue. Again, that's not an issue that government can handle or is in any way, shape, or form equipped to handle. That is, it starts with the family, it starts with the parents, and it builds out into the community, and things like, ties to your community, and being able to find meaningful work, and having close, good relationships with friends and family members, and things like that are all things that keep you from developing these types of addictions. So
Yeah,
I feel like, we've got to find a way to address that.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I think what the problem is that the government has already overstepped those things. So they've already worked their way into the institutions like marriage and community and your social community, your churches. Government has already crossed those boundaries. So to now say, well, we just don't want them involved at all is almost like we already lost that battle. We have to figure out something else. Which is why I say, okay, let's legislate things. Since the government wants all this power, let's legislate things in our favor instead of legislating things further opposing our favor. So for me, like, I understand what you mean when you say, like, the infrastructure around a person and the community around a person should really matter more than the government. And I agree. The problem is that that's not how it is right now. And so I want to see a turn in the government's disposition if that makes sense. I want to see a turn in what they want to deem appropriate and what they don't. Because right now, what the government wants to deem appropriate is essentially anarchy, right? Gender fluidity as a whole, critical race theory, abortion on demand, no borders, open borders. All of these things are kind of pushing for this anarchy of a society. And to me, the drug part, if we legalize all drugs, that's just first of all, that's toxic capitalism, which, believe it or not, as a conservative, I think that there's certain parts of capitalism that are kind of toxic. But
capitalism, just for the sake of capitalism, can be toxic. It has to be underpinned to some kind of moral foundation, right?
Yes.
But where we differ, obviously, is who gets to be in charge of that moral foundation.
Yeah.
And to me, politicians should definitely not be it.
So maybe this is where the disconnect is, and I'm sorry I have this off. I'm trying to hear myself, but the disconnect is like, I don't necessarily want politicians to decide what's good or bad. I want what the Constitution is based on to decide what's good or bad, right? So for me, I'm personally a Christian, but I think that apart from me being a Christian, the Constitution is founded on Judeo-Christian values. And even, John Adams has the famous quote, which I think I mentioned in one of the comments somewhere in that post, that the Constitution can only be upheld and related by a good and a moral and religious people, meaning that without the basis of like a compatible or a joined religion, like something that we all agree on, there's no way that the Constitution can be upheld, which in my opinion is what we're seeing happen with postmodernism and all this stuff. We no longer have an up or down. We no longer have a good or bad. So the government has no incentive to legislate things that are morally objectively good. They're just legislating whatever benefits them, because none of us believe in morally objective good anymore. So my solution is not so much let government take more power. My solution is like, let's hold government's feet to the fire to do what's objectively morally good. And where I get that objectivity from would be the Bible, which is essentially the basis of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. And so where does the Bible come into play on drug use?
For you should not have a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and sound mind. That's just one verse that talks about, your body being a temple. Now, the body being a temple verse is kind of, people tend to think of that as like your personal body, but it means the body of Christ is a temple, right? So I think that is kind of even more favorable to my argument, because we want to make sure that our communities are a safe place for people to experience life and to grow in relationship with God and do everything that you would want as a kind of Christian American family would. Now I'm generalizing, but I think that the Bible fits into this pretty much just as a guiding principle, just guiding values that will dictate, what we should and shouldn't do with our bodies.
Yeah. And I think I heard you mention earlier that, weed was a different story. So, then we start getting into the nitty gritty of like, okay, whose drugs of choice are legal and whose aren't, and who gets to decide that. And, we're all human. We all have vices. Some of us, it's food. Some of us, it's Netflix. Some of us, it's, insert anything here. We're all addicted in some way to something. So right. Who gets to be the deciding voice on what's allowed and what's not?
So I think there's a pragmatic approach to that, right? I say weed is a different story because people have a lot more arguments for why weed should be legal than I think why heroin should be legal, right? I think there's advocates for the weed thing where there's not really advocates for like heroin is good for you. There's
Dr.
morphine
Carl
and stuff
Hart
like that.
is actually one of those people.
That injecting heroin into your veins and doing it recreationally is good for you?
I believe he does it recreationally, yes.
That's insane.
And
okay, so that's
he's a neuroscientist.
Jeez. Okay, well, I got to look at that because I've never heard of him. I'll look into that.
Super interesting guy.
But I guess what I'm saying is the general consensus of what's going to be okay for you physically, people would be more likely to say yes to weed than to heroin, right? And so the weed thing I think is interesting because I personally, I used to smoke a lot of weed. I'm very against it, but that I understand to be more of a personal thing. I just don't see the benefits in it. But for all drugs across the board, illicit or not, I do think that there is a scientific or a health exemption for it, right? So if it will be able to help somebody in some sort of specific disease, then and they can kind of synthesize the drug to do that, then I think that's okay. And I guess that's just where my argument starts to
Including
break
things
down.
like mental wellness types of treatments and things like they're using all kinds of psychedelics now to help with PTSD
I've heard that,
and
yeah.
depression and that kind of thing. So I guess that would fall under your medical exemption
I
clause.
think, yes, I will say with the exemption to super experimental things that really don't have a basis in science, I say yes. If they have a basis in science, if scientists are saying, and I don't mean like this science trademarked, I mean like actual, um, scientific method, it's been proven over and over again that this works, then sure, I have no problem with that. But I think where my problem lies is the recreational use that does damage to not only the person that's taking it, but then the people surrounding them and the people that have to send them to rehab and the people that have to take care of them and get stolen from because they're addicts, stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's really where my I guess big digression is.
Yeah, and I feel like, we already have laws in place to protect us against some of those things, right? Like it's the crimes that are sometimes a result of drug abuse are already accounted for. You still can't steal from people, you still can't murder them, no matter what.
Yeah.
But I feel like any kind of like our primary intent for any kind of drug policy um, should be number one to keep people safe and number two to respect their autonomy. I mean, these are still adults that we're talking about. These are not children for the most part. We don't need to infantilize them. So how do
Mhm.
we keep people safe from things like fentanyl showing up in their heroin unexpectedly, and how do we respect their autonomy as adult American citizens?
Well, I think there's a difference between um, not legislating whether drugs are legal or not and incentivizing people to use them, right? Which is what we saw kind of in California, where the government was providing clean needles for addicts who are homeless or who can't get their hands on clean needles. That turned the city into a dump in maybe less than 2 years. There was needles everywhere on the ground. I think it was, what is it, Colorado that legalized pretty much all drugs, and their crime skyrocketed instantly. I think that most of the
Well, what
time
year was that? Was that during the lockdown? Because I could see that having
it was
an
before the
impact as
lockdown.
well.
No, it was 2019, I think. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it was 2019 because I remember being in Colorado when it was there. So I was traveling and there wasn't COVID yet. I wasn't muzzled on a plane yet. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I mean, free needles, like we're all aware any kind of like government handout program usually doesn't end well for the people that
right.
it's aimed at.
Well, that's not
But
that different than legalizing it, putting it in stores and selling it though.
how?
Well, there's free bread lines, and people take it and leave it. But there's also places you can go to buy bread, and homeless people do that too. They'll scrub together some change and they'll buy some bread. So it's less about trying to control behavior and to control human nature, and it's more so about de-incentivizing people who have nothing to do with it from ever getting involved with it, right? Because if it's illegal and it's an underground thing and there's not much of it to be found, and if it is found, it'll be penalized heavily. The risk is way higher, and most people don't have a high risk threshold, so they're not going to go out of their way to experiment with these things. Whereas like cocaine nowadays is like weed was 20 years ago. It's like it's just everywhere and nobody really cares about it. And to me, I think that's a problem because that's going to lead to people doing it earlier, underdeveloped minds using cocaine, and eventually it's going to decay a society morally and with their health. And so I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I can't help but like, draw the parallels here between alcohol prohibition
Hmm.
and drug prohibition. I mean, didn't we learn our lesson when the 18th Amendment failed miserably? I mean, all that happened, it was the same kind of argument. Like, we need a moral society. We've got to keep our fathers and husbands out of the bars and from, spending their entire paycheck on their bar tab. let's just get rid of alcohol altogether so that we can have a more moral, family-friendly society. And what ended up happening was, in fact, it made everything a million times worse. It bred corruption and crime and all kinds of things that uh, were not intended or wanted. And I feel like it's the same thing with any type. It doesn't matter what kind of drug. The more you push it underground, the more you say you can't have it, the more people want it, and the more they're going to do whatever it takes to get it.
Right. So I don't think that legalizing alcohol, selling it in stores, really did that much to change how much people misused it. Right. So I mean, I definitely agree with the corruption point, where you continue to subdue something and there becomes a whole underworld with it, et cetera, et cetera. But you could say the same thing about sex trafficking. It's illegal and it's underground, and it's very dangerous because it's so underground. That doesn't mean that we should legalize it, right? So I think that when it comes to alcohol, there's a lot of pros when it comes to abolishing the 18th, like you said, and it does make sense. But we still have a lot of guardrails. We still have a lot of restrictions on alcohol. There's a lot of things that we can and can't do when it comes to alcohol. There's even ways in particular that you have to sell alcohol. You can't sell to a specific kind of company. Like, you can't sell to a wholesaler all of these different liquors. You have to buy from certain people, and there's all these weird parameters I remember hearing about when I worked in the food service industry. So for me, it's like, if we're going to legalize, what will be the parameters, and how will we be enforcing those parameters? Because DUIs are very, very severely punished, and so is public intoxication and stuff like that. Of course, there's still people that take advantage of it, and like you said, there always will be. But we have to understand that it is an objectively bad thing, a morally bad thing. Alcohol is not necessarily a morally good thing. When it comes to like the scriptural basis for it, yes, there's wine in the Bible, but it said the Bible is clear about saying do not be a drunkard. Don't drink yourself to sleep. All of these things. There's parameters around it, and so I guess that's maybe what I'm advocating more so than anything. What are going to be the parameters about it if we want to legalize all these illicit drugs? And for me, those parameters would be, well, if it's for medicine, it's okay. If we're penalizing the dealers, it's okay. But I want to make sure that we're not incentivizing people to do it more, because that's what it's seeming like, in particular with, the way Colorado has legalized everything and the free needles in California. It feels like we're just incentivizing this behavior, and I feel like there's no need for that. I think we should be doing the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to be said about, the amount of people that are in prison for petty drug crimes that, in most of it's possession. All they did was have it on their person.
Yeah.
There were no victims involved. But
that
definitely,
needs to be reworked, for sure.
I completely agree that there have to be parameters. You can't, get drunk and get in your car. Okay,
Yeah.
you can't, do those kinds of things. Still have to apply because it puts someone else's life directly in jeopardy. But if you're talking about severely punishing dealers, well, it has to come from somewhere. So why not make the dealers go legit, start a company, pay taxes, and sell it above board, the whole thing, bring it all out into the light. We want to see what you're doing. We want to see how you're making it. And I think one interesting thing that I just saw the other day is, like, in California, where, recreational marijuana use is legal now. The government has gotten so heavily involved in that process, and they've come up with all these regulations around it to try and make everyone feel okay about it, that it's still more profitable to sell it on the black market. It's just too much for people to, too many hoops to jump through, too many fines to pay, too many taxes to worry about, too many forms to get filled out. The path to actually becoming a legal seller is just incredibly difficult. And I find that to be, kind of funny that, like, we wanted it to be legal so we could make it safer and better, and it's actually having the other impact because government has gotten their dirty, grubby little hands too involved.
Well, now we're getting to a place where we agree, which is that the government is too involved in business in general, right? And
Right.
there's so much red tape around anything you want to do, whether it's opening up a weed shop or opening up a food truck. You know, the government's just way too involved. There's too much legislation. There's too many things that you have to do to be a small business owner. Where I think that kind of backfires on itself is that, you know, there's an example. I don't know if you've heard of Tim Ballard.
I haven't.
So he's a former special ops agent for the government. He works now partnered with the government on his own to save people from sex trafficking, right? And so he'll go to these other countries and he'll essentially buy the girls or buy the children off of these people and bring them and rescue them and bring them back to America, and you know, kind of provide them for. There's a whole organization he has built around that. One of the stories that he tells is that in some countries sex trafficking is legal. And so what ends up happening is they create storefronts, and maybe it's just a prostitution storefront, right? Like of age women, there's parameters like that. You have to be of age if you choose to, of your own volition, be a prostitute. Then you're okay to do so, et cetera, et cetera. But what ends up happening is that just becomes a storefront for the real nefarious activity, which is underage children being sex trafficked. And now when the government goes to try and audit them, tries to investigate into them, they have all of this protection of being a legitimate business that stops the government from investigating them. Because the minute the government steps its foot into the doors, it's like, okay, do you have a warrant? Do you have this paperwork? Do you have that? Why are you harassing me? Why are you harassing me? I'm just a business owner. You know, so you have all these possible legal actions that this essentially child sex trafficker can take against their government for just wanting to investigate them because they claim to be, you know, a regular old prostitution thing, which I don't think is regular, but you understand the parallels. So my parallel would be from that to, let's say, you know, weed or illicit drugs, maybe not weed, but you open up a business savvy, a legit heroin store, but the real nefarious stuff is still going on in the background, and now it's that much harder for the government to look into everything that's going on in the background because you have to have probable cause, you have to be, you know, you have to have a reason to check out this small business owner. So I think that's where my head is at when I think, like, can these businesses really even go legit? Because like you said, most of these companies, it's going to be more profitable for them to stay on the black market anyway. There's no, you know, they could just rob somebody at gunpoint, get their merchandise, and then they can sell it off in the black market, and they don't have to pay taxes on it. They don't have to do anything. They just do whatever they want. It's a whole underground world. So it to me, it seems like an isolated thought to think that, you know, drug dealers, like huge cartel drug dealers that are pretty much importing our whole supply of drugs into this country or growing them, whatever the case, it's hard for me to believe that they're going to see that these drugs are now legal and then just go legit. That to me kind of contradicts human nature. It's like these guys are bred criminals, born criminals. They're not going to.
Well, they want to make the most amount of money for the least amount of effort that they possibly can. And the way the incentives are set up now is to be a criminal. That's the best way for them to make money, right? So
I think that's
if it was just as
it.
easy to make money legally, what would keep them from doing that?
Then they wouldn't have the thrill that they've had for these years. You know, you get addicted to adrenaline as a human. Like you have a certain rush of doing because you do things illegal. It's one of the reasons that people go to jail and then they come out and they go right back in because they need that rush of doing something that they're not supposed to. It sounds kind of juvenile, but it's kind of how we are as humans. So that's why I think, like, okay, maybe they'll do the legit thing, but then they'll have another deal that's a side hustle that maybe now that illicit drugs are legal, now I keep going to this example, but it's the most dramatic one I can think of. Now sex trafficking is illegal, and there's more money to be made in that. So they just go over to that, and they have a hand in that, and now they have a front end of nefarious people that they can do business with and network with under the guise of like an illicit drugstore. But now they have all this extra cargo as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we also can't, you know, talk about this without talking about the level of government corruption that's involved in the illicit drug trade. I mean,
Yeah,
you
100%.
can't tell me that the DEA and the ATF are not involved in, you know, proliferating the work of these criminals. Like
Yeah.
that's happening. So by continuing to allow them to, continuing to fund these operations and continuing to ask them to do this work that, in the end isn't really getting us anywhere. I mean, why?
Yeah, I think it goes back to kind of where we started, where it's like I don't want to give the government, any special department in the government even, more power. I want to hold their feet to the fire to do things that are going to benefit our society and be actually morally good. Which, again, when I say morally good, I mean according to like a Judeo-Christian worldview. So I think I agree with you. The corruption in the government is just as much a part of the problem as the casual drug user or the drug dealer. It's just a matter of like who's holding them accountable. Supposedly, now this isn't ideal. This is like in unicorn land, but supposedly us, the people, are supposed to hold our government accountable. It's just a matter of figuring out how we do that.
Well, we're all too busy binge watching Netflix to worry about what they're doing. So
Yeah, 100%.
yeah.
Yeah. So I think we agree mostly government bad.
Yeah. Hey,
Yeah.
it's right there in my username.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But no, I genuinely, honestly enjoy disagreeing with somebody and talking through points and being civil and then not leaving, trying to cancel each other. So this is definitely, awesome. And I can't wait to put it online, see what people think. And, I'd like to do it again if we ever disagree on another topic.
Yeah,
It would be
let's
awesome.
do it about a different topic that I, know more about and am more well versed in.
For sure. For sure. Anyway, if you want to plug anything, this is, please, floor is yours.
Yeah, follow us at Girls Against Government on Instagram. And that's
Very
the
cool.
only place we are right now.
All right, sounds good. All right, thanks again.
for having me.
No problem. Stick around. I'm going to stop recording.
All right.